The first sound was the shattering of glass. Not the boisterous crash of a saloon brawl, but a sharp, clean crack that sliced through the dusty afternoon quiet of the Redemption Savings and Trust. Andrew Hudson, standing at the teller's window, felt his daughter Clara's small hand tighten in his. He looked down into her wide, questioning eyes, a 5-year-old's world of sunshine and wagon rides, suddenly invaded by a sound that held no place in it. Then the doors flew open. They were 3 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, their movements practiced and swift. Dust from the street swirled in behind them, motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that now seemed to witness a profanity. The tallest of them, a man who moved with a predator's unsettling grace, leveled a silver-inlaid revolver at the portly bank manager. "Ladies, gentlemen," and the man's voice was surprisingly articulate, a rich baritone laced with a chilling amusement. "This is a redistribution of wealth. Your cooperation will ensure it remains a simple financial transaction. Your resistance." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, will make it an altogether more personal affair. Fear, a metallic taste in the back of the throat, swept through the room. The half-dozen patrons and 2 tellers froze. Andrew instinctively pulled Clara behind him, his body a shield, his hand resting on her head, to keep her tucked against his leg. He could feel the fine tremor running through her small frame. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, suffocating silence. He had $2,000 in a canvas sack on the counter, the entire proceeds from his cattle sale. It was the money that would finally secure the deed to his ranch, turning 5 years of backbreaking labor and whispered prayers into something real, something permanent for his daughter. The 2 subordinate robbers moved efficiently, sweeping cash from the teller drawers into saddlebags. But the leader, he didn't move toward the money. His gaze, dark and assessing over the edge of his bandana, scanned the petrified faces in the room. He seemed to be looking for something more than coin. His eyes landed on Andrew. Perhaps it was the way Andrew stood, not cowering, but rooted to the spot, a quiet bulwark of defiance. Or perhaps it was the glint of silver at his throat. The leader stepped forward, his boots scuffing softly on the polished floorboards. "That's a fine piece you have there," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was more menacing than a shout. He gestured with the barrel of his revolver. "On your neck." Andrew's hand went instinctively to the locket. It was a simple silver oval worn smooth by the touch of his fingers over the years. Inside was the only portrait he had of his late wife, Sarah. A tiny hand-tinted photograph of her, smiling, her eyes full of the light that had been extinguished far too soon. It was more than a possession. It was a sacrament. "It has no value to you," Andrew said, his voice low and steady, though it cost him every ounce of his control. The man chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Everything has value, my friend. It's merely a question of what kind." He moved closer, the scent of leather sweat and something acrid like gunpowder preceding him. "I'll trouble you for it." Andrew didn't move. He felt Clara's fingers dig into the rough denim of his trousers. The world narrowed to the space between him and the barrel of the gun. He could see the man's eyes above the cloth, intelligent, patient, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Papa," Clara whispered, her voice a tiny, frightened plea. That single word broke his resolve. With a hand that trembled slightly, Andrew lifted the chain over his head. The silver felt cold against his skin, then suddenly warm in his palm as he held it out. The robber didn't take it. Instead, he reached out and deftly plucked it from Andrew's fingers, the chain slithering like a snake. He held it up, letting it swing in the light. "You see," he said, his voice almost a purr, "a simple transaction." He flipped it open with his thumb. Andrew flinched as if struck. The man stared at the tiny portrait of Sarah for a long moment. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his eyes before he snapped it shut. "A beautiful woman," he murmured, tucking the locket into his vest pocket. "A shame." He then turned his attention back to his men. "We're done here." They backed out of the bank as swiftly as they had entered, melting back into the indifferent sun of the street. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were a woman's stifled sob and the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the passage of seconds that had irrevocably altered Andrew's life. He knelt, pulling Clara into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with silent sobs. The money on the counter was gone. The future of his ranch was gone. But as Andrew held his daughter's hand, going to the empty place on his chest, he knew the greater theft was the one that left no physical void, only a hollow, aching chasm where a memory had lived. The man hadn't just stolen silver. He had stolen Sarah all over again. The weeks that followed the robbery laid a pall over the high plains. An early frost silvered the brittle grass, and the wind carried the first bitter promise of winter. Andrew's ranch, nestled in a shallow valley, carved by a creek that ran thin in the autumn, felt more isolated than ever. The silence in the log cabin was a heavy thing, punctuated only by Clara's questions, which he struggled to answer, and the lowing of his remaining cattle. His neighbor Thomas Grady had offered a loan, but Andrew had refused. He was a man who paid his own way, or not at all. His pride, like the rocky soil of his land, was stubborn and unyielding. The bank had given him an extension, but their patience was a finite resource, and the shadow of foreclosure loomed like the stark, skeletal cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. His only company besides Clara was Jedediah "Jed" Stone, a wiry old ranch hand whose face was a roadmap of 70 hard-won years. Jed had worked for Andrew's father and had stayed on after he passed a fixture as permanent as the stone hearth. "You're thinking on it again," Jed said one evening, his voice a gravelly rasp. He sat across the rough-hewn table, nursing a cup of coffee. Andrew was staring into the fire, his hands idle. "The locket." Andrew didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Just a thing," Andrew Jed continued, gentler than his usual tone. "You got the real part of her right here." He tapped his temple with a gnarled finger. "And right there." He nodded toward Clara, who was asleep on her cot, her rag doll clutched in her arms. He looked at her picture. Jed Andrew said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Sarah, and then he took her. Jed sighed, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Fella's name is Elias Cutter. Sheriff Brody rode out while you were mending fence last week. Cutter and his crew have been hitting towns all along the rail spur. Not just a thief, he's a viper. Brody says he enjoys the fear more than the money." The name settled in the air, cold and hard. Elias Cutter. It now had a shape, a sound to go with the memory of those cold, intelligent eyes. It was 2 weeks later, with the weight of Cutter's name still heavy on his mind, that Andrew hitched the wagon for a trip to Redemption. He needed salt beans and flour, the staples that would see them through the coming snows. He needed to feel the semblance of normalcy, to pretend for a few hours that his world wasn't slowly crumbling. Redemption baked under a pale, unforgiving sun. The wind, coming down sharp from the high ridges, curled grit along the boardwalks and rattled the loose sign above the mercantile. As he drew the wagon to a halt, Clara clinging to his coat, he saw her. She was a thin shape near the butcher's refuse barrel, a creature of shadow and bone. Her black hair hung in tangled strands, clinging to hollow cheeks. She was young, maybe 20, but hunger and hardship had carved years onto her face. As Andrew watched, she pulled a piece of spoiled bread from the barrel and brought it to her lips, her movements furtive and desperate. Then came the laughter, sharp and cruel as breaking glass. 2 boys no older than 12 were tossing pebbles at her. One struck her shoulder, making her flinch, but she made no sound. She simply curled tighter over her scavenged meal, as if to protect it from the world. Men leaned on posts, women stepped around her with their baskets, a town full of eyes that saw nothing worth stopping for. Something inside Andrew, a raw nerve, exposed by the bank robbery, twisted tight. He saw in her the same vulnerability, he had felt the same violation of dignity, by a force that was casually cruel. Before he had even made a conscious decision, he was stepping down from the wagon, his boots crunching in the thick dust. His shadow fell over the boys, and they froze. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The quiet, unyielding weight of his gaze was enough. The rocks dropped from their hands, and they scattered into the alleys. The woman didn't run. She remained crouched, her breath shallow, her dark eyes fixed on the bread clutched in her hands. Andrew crouched, his knees creaking so their eyes were level. Beneath the grime and fear, he saw a stubborn flicker of pride, a refusal to be completely broken. Papa Clara's voice was a soft question from the wagon. Andrew stood and walked into the mercantile. He returned with a fresh half-loaf of bread, its warmth seeping into his palm. He broke it and placed a piece in the woman's hands. She stared at it, as if he'd handed her gold. Clara, leaning from the wagon's seat, offered the small biscuit she had saved from breakfast. The woman's fingers trembled as she took it, and when her eyes met the child's, a single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. That should have been the end of it. But the sheriff, a weary man named Brody with a face like tanned leather, emerged from his office. Hudson Brody called his voice flat with pragmatism. "You don't want to be meddling. Word is there's men looking for her. One of Cutter's crew was in the saloon last night, asking after a runaway. Best let her be." The name Cutter struck Andrew like a physical blow. He looked from the sheriff's tired face to the terrified woman. This wasn't some random misfortune. This was a piece of the same darkness that had violated his life. It was Elias Cutter's shadow stretching all the way here to this refuse barrel. "She ain't yours to feed, Brody," finished a note of finality in his tone. Andrew met his gaze. He thought of the locket in Cutter's pocket. He thought of Clara's terror. He thought of this woman starving and hunted by the same man. A line had been drawn that day in the bank, and he found himself standing on the other side of it. Without a word, he extended a hand to the woman. She flinched and then looked at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, questioning hope. He gently helped her to her feet and guided her to the wagon. Clara immediately slid over on the bench, patting the space beside her. The woman hesitated, her gaze darting around the street, but then she climbed aboard. Sheriff Brody shook his head, a gesture of resignation, and turned away. The town's eyes burned into Andrew's back as he clicked the reins. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a man who had meddled. He was driving away from redemption with Cutter's property, sitting beside his daughter toward the open land where the wind carried the promise of both shelter and a gathering storm. The journey back to the ranch was a study in silence. The woman who would later whisper her name was May Lynn, clutched the bread as if it were an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Clara, with the simple, profound empathy of a child, eventually laid her small hand on the woman's arm. May Lynn started, then slowly, tentatively covered the child's hand with her own. The cabin, when they arrived at dusk, seemed to exhale a sigh of welcome. Smoke curled from the chimney, a steady gray ribbon against a sky of bruised violet and rose. Jed was standing on the porch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered from Andrew to May Lynn, and a deep line formed between his brows. Took in a stray, Jed asked, his voice low as Andrew helped May Lynn from the wagon. She needed a safe place. Andrew said simply, leaving no room for argument. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the smell of pine smoke wrapped around them. May Lynn stood just inside the door, a wraith caught in the firelight, her eyes taking in the humble room as if it were a mirage. When Clara tugged her hand and led her to a chair by the hearth, she sank into it, her body seeming to fold in on itself with exhaustion. The days that followed fell into a fragile rhythm. Mei Lin spoke little her English, a collection of broken fragments, but her hands were never still. She swept the hearth, mended Clara's clothes with neat, tiny stitches, and helped Jed in the garden, her movements quiet and efficient. She was earning her keep, proving her worth in a world that had told her she had none. Clara became her shadow, chattering away, teaching her the names of things: spoon, blanket, fire. Mei Lin would repeat the words softly, her accent shaping them into something new, a shy smile gracing her lips when she got them right. But beneath the surface of this newfound domesticity, a current of fear ran deep. Mei Lin startled at the sound of a horse, her body tensing, her eyes darting toward the horizon. She never sat with her back to the door. She was a guest in a sanctuary, but she knew the wolves were still outside. Andrew saw it all. He also saw the way Clara blossomed under Mei Lin's gentle attention. He heard laughter in the cabin that had been absent for years. One evening, Mei Lin was humming a soft, lilting melody as she braided Clara's hair, a folk song from a land he couldn't imagine. Clara leaned into the sound, her eyes heavy with sleep. Andrew sat across the room cleaning his rifle, and the melody seeped into the hollow spaces inside him, stirring a feeling that was painfully close to peace. The first obstacle to that peace came a week later. From the ridge overlooking his valley, Andrew saw them, two riders sitting motionless on their horses, their silhouettes stark against the afternoon sky. They weren't neighbors. They weren't lost. They were watching. They were scouting. His blood ran cold. He didn't tell Mei Lin what he'd seen, but that evening he took down the spare rifle from above the mantelpiece. "Every soul on this land needs to know how to defend it," he said, his voice even. He led her out to the field behind the barn as dusk bled across the sky. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. Her hands trembled, and the weapon was heavy and awkward in her grasp. The first time she fired, the recoil sent her stumbling back, her eyes wide with shock. Again he said, his voice gentle but firm. She set her jaws, spark of the same defiance he'd seen in town flaring in her eyes. She loaded the rifle, braced herself, and fired again. The shot went wide, but she didn't stumble. They stayed out there until the moon rose, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing in the valley, a declaration that this small, isolated patch of earth would not be taken easily. As they walked back to the cabin, the smell of gunpowder clinging to them, Mei Lin looked at him, her dark eyes searching his in the pale light. "You fight?" "For me," she whispered, the question full of disbelief. "I fight for my home." Andrew answered, his gaze sweeping over the cabin where a lamp now glowed in the window, a beacon of warmth with his daughter sleeping safely inside. "You're part of it now." The words hung in the cold night air, a statement of fact that felt dangerously like a promise. He saw the glint of tears in her eyes before she quickly looked away. The riders on the ridge had changed everything. The fragile peace was over. Now the waiting began. The threat of Elias Cutter was a physical presence, as tangible as the winter chill that crept through the cabin's chinks. Andrew began a quiet investigation, riding into redemption. Not for supplies, but for information. He'd sit in the corner of the saloon, nursing a single whiskey, listening to the low murmur of conversations from cattlemen and prospectors. The name Cutter was spoken in hushed, wary tones. He was more than a bandit. He was a predator of a different sort. He didn't just rob, he dismantled. Men spoke of how he'd bought up the dead on ranches near the rail line, squeezing their owners with impossible terms until they were forced to sell for pennies on the dollar. He was building an empire on the back of others' despair, with a small army of hired guns to enforce his will. Sheriff Brody, worn down and under-equipped, could do little more than keep the trouble from spilling onto Redemption's main street. "He's a patient man," Brody told Andrew one afternoon outside the smithy. "He circles his prey, learns their weaknesses. Then he strikes. This girl you're keeping, she's a weakness he'll be keen to exploit." Andrew's jaw tightened. "She's not a weakness." Brody gave him a long, tired look. "To a man like you, Hudson, she's the very definition of one." The sheriff's words echoed in his mind on the ride home. He was right. Andrew's own code of honor, his inability to turn away from someone in need, was the vulnerability Cutter would use against him. Back at the ranch, May Lynn was slowly, painfully sharing her own story. It came in halting fragments during the quiet evening hours after Clara was asleep. She spoke of being brought from her homeland on a promise of a good job, only to be sold in San Francisco like livestock. Cutter hadn't been her first owner, but he was the most brutal. He'd bought her at a card game a trophy to be used and displayed. She described his headquarters a fortified ranch house 2 days' ride east, and the casual cruelty of his men. "He likes to break things," she whispered one night, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "Horses, men, me." She pulled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing a pale, jagged scar on her forearm. "He says everything has a price, or a breaking point." But Andrew sensed she was holding something back. There were gaps in her story, moments where she would fall silent, her eyes clouding over with a fear that seemed different, more specific than her general trauma. He didn't press her. Trust was a sapling in rocky soil. It could not be forced. The midpoint of their precarious peace arrived with the first heavy snow. Andrew was checking his fence line near the southern ridge when he found him one of Cutter's men, his horse dead with a broken leg in a gully, the man himself half frozen and delirious, a nasty gash on his head. Andrew, unable to leave even an enemy to die in the snow, hoisted the man onto his own horse and brought him back to the barn. He tied him to a support beam and waited for him to wake. Jed stood by, shotgun in hand, his face grim. When the man's eyes finally fluttered open, they were filled with a surly defiance. "Cutter will gut you for this," he spat, testing the ropes. "He'll have to find you first," Andrew said calmly. "You were watching my home. Why?" The man sneered. "Looking for the girl, of course. Boss wants his property back. Cutter has dozens of men. He's building an empire. Why is one runaway so important to him?" Andrew pressed, leaning in close. Something didn't add up. The man's bravado began to crack under Andrew's cold, steady gaze. He was young, barely out of his teens, and the reality of his situation was setting in. "It ain't about her, you fool," he finally mumbled, his eyes darting away. "Not really." "Then what is it about?" The man hesitated, then a cruel smirk played on his lips. "It's about you. It's always been about you, Hudson." Andrew felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I don't know you. I don't know Cutter." "Oh, he knows you." The man said the words dripping with venom. "He knows all about the big righteous rancher who shot a man down in cold blood in the dusty street of Willow Creek 5 years back." The world tilted on its axis. Willow Creek. The name was a ghost, a memory he had buried under years of hard work and grief. A shootout, a land dispute that had turned ugly. He had been faster. It had been self-defense. The marshal had cleared him. But a man had died. A young man with wild eyes and a reckless temper. His name, Andrew's voice was a choked whisper, was Jacob Cutter. The captured man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that filled the cold barn. his little brother. Elias never forgave you, never forgot. He's been looking for you for years. Heard you'd settled out here trying to build a life. He's been buying up the ranches around you, squeezing, just waiting for the right moment to take everything from you, just like you took his brother from him. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The bank robbery, the theft of the locket, a deliberate personal wound, Cutter's presence in the area. It was all a web, and he was the fly caught at its center. And the girl, Andrew asked, his voice hollow. The perfect tool, the man sneered. Knew your type. Honorable. Can't resist a damsel in distress. She runs right to your door, and she brings the whole world of trouble down on you. He was going to let you get comfortable, let you think you'd saved her, maybe even start to care for her. And then he was going to ride in and burn it all to the ground with you in it. Andrew stumbled back, his hand braced against a wooden stall. He felt Jed's steadying hand on his shoulder. His past hadn't just come back to haunt him. It had been hunting him. And Mei Lin. She wasn't the cause of the storm. She was just the bait in the trap. A trap that had been sprung the moment he'd helped her into his wagon. He was devastated, the weight of his past, now crushing the fragile hope he had allowed himself to feel for the future. The revelation in the barn shattered the fragile world Andrew had begun to build. He looked at Mei Lin now through a haze of suspicion and betrayal. Every kind gesture, every shared silence was tainted. Had she known, was she a willing participant, or just an unwitting pawn in Cutter's cruel game? He cut the captured man loose, gave him a water skin and a piece of jerky, and sent him walking east into the snow-covered plains. "Tell Cutter I'm waiting," was all Andrew said. Killing an unarmed man, even this one, was a line he wouldn't cross. When he entered the cabin, the warmth of the fire felt like a lie. Mei Lin was at the table teaching Clara how to form letters on a piece of slate. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that now twisted like a knife in his gut. His trust, once given, was a hard thing to reclaim when broken. He confronted her that night, his voice low and strained after Clara was asleep. "Did you know," he asked, the word stripped of all warmth. "Did you know who I was when you came here?" Fear and confusion washed over her face. What means? Cutter, his brother, Jacob Cutter, Willow Creek. He laid the names out like stones on the table between them. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the sudden sharp intake of breath. Her face went pale. She had known. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. "I hear them talk," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "Cutter's men. They talk of the man who killed Jacob, the rancher near Redemption. When you helped me in town. I hear your name. Hudson." I was afraid. Afraid of what he demanded, his voice rising. Afraid I'd throw you out, or afraid your part in this was over. "No," she cried, shrinking back from his anger. "I was afraid you would not help if you know, afraid you send me away. I stay because you are good man. You and Clara." Her voice broke on a sob. "I did not want to bring trouble." "You didn't bring it?" He said the words cold and bitter. "You were just the key that unlocked the door." He turned away from her, the sense of betrayal, a sickness in his stomach. Before she could say another word, before the rift between them could widen into an uncrossable chasm, the sound of a lone rider moving at a desperate gallop cut through the night. It was Thomas Grady, his face frantic in the lantern light. "Andrew, it's Cutter. He's in town. He's got the sheriff's boy." The world stopped. Cutter hadn't come for the ranch. He had changed the battlefield. He rode into town an hour ago. Grady gasped, his horse heaving. Took young Will Brody from the street. He's holding him in the saloon. He sent word. He doesn't want the girl. He wants you. Face him by sunrise, or the boy dies. It was a masterful, cruel stroke. Cutter had taken a strategic hostage, neutralizing the law and forcing Andrew's hand. He couldn't hide behind his rifle on his own land. He had to walk into the lion's den. Andrew's mind raced. He had to go. But leaving Clara. He looked from Jed's grim face to Mei Lin's tear-streaked one. He had no choice but to entrust his daughter's life to the very people who now stood at the center of his shattered trust. Jed, you stay here. Bar the door. Shoot anything that isn't me. He commanded, his voice raw with urgency. He turned to Mei Lin, his eyes hard. You will keep her safe. No matter what happens to me, you keep her safe. Do you understand? She met his gaze, her own fear eclipsed by a sudden fierce resolve. She nodded, a single sharp movement. I keep her safe. She vowed, her voice clear and steady for the first time. I swear on my life. Andrew saddled his mare, his movements jerky and hurried. As he swung into the saddle, he could feel the weight of it all, of the ghost of Jacob Cutter, the loss of Sarah's locket, the life of a boy, and the future of his own daughter. He was riding into a trap, a reckoning years in the making, leaving everything he loved behind, guarded by an old man and a woman whose heart he no longer knew. The wind howled, picking up snow and grit, a precursor to the sandstorm the old-timers had been predicting. It was a fitting herald for the confrontation to come. He spurred his horse and disappeared into the churning darkness, riding toward redemption. The ride to town was a battle against the elements and the demons in his own mind. A fierce sandstorm, the brutal signature of a plains winter, had descended from the mountains. Grit-laden wind tore at him, stinging his eyes and scouring the landscape into a formless, howling gray void. The world was reduced to the frantic breathing of his horse and the singular burning purpose that drove him forward. Redemption was a ghost town, its street empty, its buildings huddled against the gale. Windows rattled in their frames, and the saloon sign creaked on its hinges in a maddening rhythmic protest. Andrew dismounted in front of the saloon and the only building spilling light into the maelstrom. He tied his mare to the rail, giving her a final pat on the neck, a silent prayer that this would not be their last ride. He pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon, usually a cacophony of noise, was eerily silent. The air was thick with tension, smelling of stale beer sawdust and fear. A dozen of Cutter's men were positioned around the room, their faces hard and watchful. Sheriff Brody stood against the far wall, his face a mask of anguish, his gun belt lying on a nearby table. In the center of the room, Elias Cutter sat at a poker table, calmly shuffling a deck of cards. Across from him, tied to a chair, was Will Brody, a boy of no more than 10, his eyes wide with terror. And on the table next to a bottle of whiskey lay Sarah's silver locket. Cutter looked up as Andrew entered, a slow, wolfish smile spreading across his face. Andrew Hudson. Punctual. I do admire that in a man. It suggests an orderly mind. Please join us. Andrew walked forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. His eyes were locked on Cutter. The rest of the room, the guns, the fear, it all faded away. Let the boy go, Cutter. This is between you and me. All in due time, Cutter said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He fanned the cards out on the table. Everything is between you and me has been for 5 years. Ever since you put a bullet in my brother. Did you know he was just 19, full of fire and foolish pride? Much like you, I imagine. He picked up the locket, dangling it from its chain. I learned all about you. The grieving husband, the devoted father, a man trying to build a monument of peace on a foundation of violence. So I decided I wouldn't grant you a quick death. That's vengeance for fools. No, my revenge is a finer art. I wanted to take away your monument stone by stone. Your land, he gestured vaguely, was the first. Your peace of mind, he held up the locket, was the second. And your future. His eyes flicked to the terrified boy. Well, that's what tonight is about. The wind howled outside, slamming against the building like a physical force. The lanterns flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. You see, Cutter continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm going to make you kill me. Right here, in front of the good sheriff and his son. You'll be a killer again. And when you hang for it, your precious daughter will be left with nothing but the legacy of a murderer. Your monument will be a pile of dust. That is my masterpiece. He drew his silver-inlaid revolver and placed it on the table, pushing it toward Andrew. Pick it up. Andrew's heart pounded. This was the choice. Vengeance. Kill the man who had tormented him, who had desecrated Sarah's memory, and seal his own fate. Or justice. But what justice was there in this room? Suddenly, the saloon doors burst open, flung wide by the gale. A figure stood silhouetted against the swirling dust, smaller than a man, wrapped in a heavy cloak. It was Mei Lin. A collective gasp went through the room. Cutter's head snapped up, his composure finally breaking. What is this? Clara is safe. Mei Lin said, her voice ringing out clear and strong, cutting through the howl of the wind. She stepped into the light, pulling back her hood. Her face was streaked with dust, but her eyes burned with a fire Andrew had never seen. Jed has her. They are hidden. You will not find them. Cutter's men shifted, raising their pistols, but Cutter held up a hand, his eyes narrowed on her. You foolish girl. You just signed your own death warrant. No, she said, her gaze shifting to Andrew. It was filled with apology, resolve, and a fierce, unwavering loyalty. I came to tell the truth. She looked back at Cutter. I heard you. In your house. I heard you talk about him. She pointed a trembling finger at Andrew. About Jacob. About your plan. I knew who he was when I came to his door. She turned fully to Andrew, her heart in her eyes. I stayed silent because I was a coward. But I stayed with you because I saw you were not a killer. You were a good man, a good father. I did not want your past to destroy you. But hiding from the truth is what will destroy you. Her words struck him with the force of a revelation. Her secret wasn't a betrayal. It was a misguided attempt to protect him, born of her own fear. In that moment, in the heart of the storm, the last wall of suspicion in his heart crumbled. He saw her not as a pawn, but as an ally. It doesn't matter. Cutter snarled, his plan unraveling. He still has to make a choice. He kicked Will Brody's chair, sending the boy whimpering to the floor. Kill me, Hudson, avenge your wife, avenge my brother. Be the man you truly are. Andrew looked at the gun on the table. He looked at Sarah's locket. He looked at Mei Lin's brave, terrified face. He thought of Clara, safe and hidden. He finally understood. Vengeance was Cutter's game, a cycle of violence that had almost consumed him. Justice was his own path. It was the harder path. He met Cutter's gaze, his own eyes clear and calm. No. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. Andrew slowly, deliberately reached out and pushed the revolver back toward Cutter. My wife's memory isn't honored by more killing, and my daughter's future won't be built on it. Cutter stared, his face contorting in disbelief, then rage. Then you all die, he roared, snatching the gun from the table. But the moment of hesitation was all it took. As Cutter raised the pistol, Sheriff Brody, seizing the opportunity, lunged from the wall, tackling Cutter from the side. The shot went wild, shattering the mirror behind the bar. Andrew moved not for the gun, but for the boy shielding him with his body. The saloon erupted into chaos as Cutter's men opened fire. Andrew drew his own revolver, the one tucked in his belt, and laid down covering fire, not to kill, but to drive them back to create an opening. Mei Lin, showing the courage he had taught her, overturned a heavy poker table, creating a barricade for them. The battle was short and brutal. In the end, it was justice, not vengeance, that won the day. Sheriff Brody, with Andrew's help, subdued a raging Elias Cutter, clamping irons on his wrists. The rest of his men, their leader captured and their will broken, surrendered or fled into the storm. As the sandstorm abated, leaving the world washed clean and raw under a bruised dawn sky, the saloon stood as a testament to the night's battle. Andrew stood with Sheriff Brody as Cutter, shackled and silent his face, a mask of cold fury, was led to the town jail. "He'll hang." Brody said, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. He looked at Andrew, his eyes holding a new respect. What he said about Willow Creek, was it true? Andrew nodded, the weight of the confession surprisingly light. He told Brody everything: the land dispute, the threats, the final confrontation where Jacob Cutter had drawn on him first. He had lived with the shadow of that day for 5 years. "I'll send a wire to the marshal in Willow Creek," Brody said. "We'll get the official record. From what you say, it was a clear case of self-defense. It's time to put that ghost to rest for good, Hudson." Andrew walked back into the saloon. Mei Lin was there, sweeping up broken glass, her movement steady. He stopped in front of her. The air between them was still charged with unspoken words. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the silver locket which he had retrieved from the table. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then up at him, her eyes shining. "Sarah," she whispered, recognizing the name from his fevered murmurs in the past weeks. "Sarah," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. He opened the clasp, showing her the tiny, smiling portrait. She would have liked you." Tears streamed down Mei Lin's face as she gently closed the locket and placed it back in his hand, her fingers lingering on his for a moment. "We go home now," she said softly. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the rising sun warming their faces. When they crested the final ridge, they saw them. Jed and Clara sitting on the porch steps, safe. Clara saw the wagon and came running, her small legs pumping, her arms outstretched. Andrew swung down from the saddle and swept her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and childhood. He held her tight, a living, breathing anchor in his tumultuous world. Over her shoulder, he saw Mei Lin dismount and watched them, a small, hopeful smile on her face. Their relationship, once built on pity and necessity, was now forged in truth and fire. Months passed. Winter thawed into a vibrant spring, and the high plains bloomed with improbable life. The news from Sheriff Brody came as promised, and the records from Willow Creek confirmed Andrew's story, and his name was officially and publicly cleared of any wrongdoing. Elias Cutter was tried and sentenced to hang, his empire of fear dismantled. With a new loan from a grateful bank manager and the help of his neighbors, Andrew secured the deed to his ranch. The paper, crisp and official, felt heavier than any stone, a foundation for the future. Life on the ranch found a new, harmonious rhythm. It was a life of shared labor and easy silences. Jed's initial skepticism toward Mei Lin had softened into a grudging, fatherly affection. Clara was a constant sunbeam of joy, flitting between the 3 adults who formed the constellation of her world. Andrew and Mei Lin's bond deepened a quiet, powerful love, growing in the space that truth and forgiveness had cleared. One clear afternoon in late summer, when the air was warm and smelled of hay and sun-baked earth, Andrew took Mei Lin and Clara to the small hill overlooking the ranch. A single weathered wooden cross stood there, marking Sarah's grave. He knelt Clara beside him and cleared away a few weeds. He took the silver locket from his pocket. For months, it had remained there, a comforting weight. He looked at Sarah's smiling face one last time, a silent conversation passing between them, one of gratitude, of peace, and of permission to live again. He didn't put it back in his pocket. Instead, he gently hung the silver chain over the arm of the wooden cross. It glinted in the sun, a final, beautiful tribute. He was not replacing his first wife. He was honoring her memory by choosing to embrace the life and love she would have wanted for him. He had finally made peace with his ghosts. He stood up, taking Mei Lin's hand in one of his and Clara's in the other. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, a new family silhouetted against the vast, open sky. As they turned to walk back down the hill, back toward the sturdy cabin that had become their home, Mei Lin stopped. She turned to him, her dark eyes luminous with a light that rivaled the sunset. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. "Andrew," she said, her voice soft but sure, placing his free hand on her stomach. "Our family, it will be bigger soon." He stared at her, his mind slow to comprehend, and then a wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He saw it all in that moment, a future stretching out before them, bright and full of promise, born from the ashes of a violent past. A future he had never dared to dream of, a redemption he had never believed he deserved.